All right, it looks like we're at 2 o'clock. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Reliability and Security Oversight Monthly Update. My name is Maylee Cook, and I'm a Training and Outreach Specialist at WECC. We'll begin, as always, with our announcements today. First, our WECC Industry Subject Matter Expert Program was announced at our San Diego workshop last October. And the application for that program is now available on our website. You're welcome to click that link and check out that application. We'd love to have you apply. So we have shared that in the chat for you. A reminder that our Enforcement Fundamentals class is happening in person on March 25th. That is this coming Monday. That will be held here at our Salt Lake office. We have just a couple seats left, but for those of you who are registered, we're looking forward to seeing you here in Salt Lake on Monday. Immediately following our Enforcement Fundamentals, we are offering our Reliability and Security Workshop, which will be here in Salt Lake City as well as virtual. The registration for those are still open through tomorrow. So if you have not grabbed your ticket yet and you would like to, that is still open for you, and we have dropped that link in the chat. For those of you already registered, we look forward to seeing you here. Following that, we also have our Reliability in the West discussion series. Our next one will be held on April 3rd. That is from 11 until noon on the first Wednesday of each month. Our topic for April will be the IBR registration process and information about that. So we look forward to having you join us for that conversation. Our antitrust policy that we begin each meeting with is all WECC meetings are conducted in accordance with the WECC antitrust policy and the NERC antitrust compliance guidelines. All participants must comply with the policy and guidelines. This meeting is public. Confidential or proprietary information should not be discussed in open session. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. By participating, you give your consent for your name, voice, image, and likeness to be included in that recording. WECC strives to ensure the information presented today is accurate and reflects the views of WECC. However, all interpretations and positions are subject to change. If you have any questions, please contact WECC's legal counsel. We would love for you to submit your questions as you hear from our presenters today. You're welcome to send that through the chat feature. You can send those messages directly to WECC meetings, or if you use the raise hand feature, we will call on you and give you the opportunity to ask that aloud. Let's take a quick look at our agenda. We're going to begin with a standards update given by Steve Rueckert, and then we will hear from Monica Vela on the evidence request tool version 8.1. And then our final presentation will be CIP12 link identification given by Mike Krum and Tom Williams. All right, I think that means it's time for Steve. We'll give you the floor.
Thank you. You can go to probably really the next slide. That's what we're going to cover. NERC and WECC activities, so you can go to the next one. Do you have fast time getting through these? There's several WECC projects going on right now. There's several that are completed and either filed with or sitting at NERC waiting for approval. But the active ones, if you will, we've got WECC 142, which was a requirement to retire the WECC Regional Standard Val 002-WECC. That's the contingency reserve standard. On June 28th of 2021, FERC approved the current version, and that had the removal of one of the requirements, that half the contingency reserve had to be operating reserve spending. Before FERC was even able to act on that, because we had filed it earlier than that, we received a SAR from the Northwest Power Pool to delete in its entirety that standard. And I'll admit I wasn't a huge fan of that request, but I don't have the authority to say, no, we can't do it. The slide just went backwards one. There we go. And so we said, well, you know what? The SAR is complete. We'll accept the SAR. We'll form a drafting team, but I made it very clear to the drafting team that nobody on the WECC staff was going to provide justification for retiring the standard, because we believe that it enhances reliability. But I said, if there's a group of people out there that can come up with a justification that we don't need it, and FERC accepts it, then the standard will be retired. And like I said, we received that SAR back in August of 2020. The WSC approved the SAR in October of 2020. So it's been 3.5 years. The drafting team met a few times early on. They were having trouble coming up with justification to retire the standard. And so then when the pandemic hit, they said, we don't want to meet. So their whole project got put in abeyance. But they probably haven't met in 2 years. And so we're gonna, at the next WSC meeting, at least discuss with the WECC Standards Committee if this project should be allowed to just languish out there with no activity, or if it should be terminated. So there'll be more news to that probably after the next meeting. The next one is WECC 153, the interchange consolidation criterion. There are currently 11 separate WECC INT criteria, and this project would be, or is, or was, to consolidate them into a single document. Remember that WECC has a requirement to review every single criterion and every single regional standard and every single regional variance in a NERC standard once every 5 years. And so with 11 of these things, we were constantly reviewing them. And when you look at them, they're all related to interchange. So we had a SAR submitted that said, why don't we combine these into a single criterion that's got all of this information in it? That'll only have to be reviewed once a year. Most of the INT reviews, we're finding no changes necessary anyway. So the drafting is complete. It's been posted several times for comment. The only comment that we've been getting is there's one WECC entity out there that has suggested that rather than be consolidated, all 11 of these criteria should just be retired. And I've urged people that have been in the conversation to remember, so far we've only heard of one entity that wants to do that. If they want to submit a SAR to do that, they can. The WECC Standards Committee has the authority to approve the retirement of a criterion and put it up for ballot. What we don't have, and this was part of the entity that suggested retirement, was instead of having it be a criterion, have it be a guideline. The WECC Standards Committee has not been delegated the authority, WECC has not been delegated the authority to draft guidelines with statutory money. One of our committees would have to pick it up if they want to see it become a guideline. So at the next WSC meeting, we're probably also going to have to discuss this. Do we want to? We've only heard one comment that this should be retired out of, I don't know how many people comment. So should the drafting team say, thank you for your comment? Yours was the only comment we got suggesting retirement. And then say to that entity, if you want to submit a SAR, you can. It may not get passed, it may get passed. If the SAR gets accepted or passed, the stakeholders may not vote to retire this document. So anyway, there's a little bit of intrigue going on with this WECC 150P project. Next one's the 154. It was the VAR 001-5 5-year review. That was a regional variance in the NERC standard. The drafting team reviewed the language of the variance, concluded that no changes were necessary. And so we'll make an informational filing with NERC that basically says, we reviewed our variance. The drafting team suggested that no changes were necessary, that everything was still fine. And if it passes the ballot, we'll just give NERC an informational filing that basically says, hey, we met our 5-year obligation to review and we don't have any changes. Next slide. There's 2 approval items. These went to the board last week. First one was BAL 004-WECC-3, the ATEC regional standard. It was basically reviewed it started out as a 5-year review, and then we got a second SAR from one of our auditors that said, hey, there's a gap in this standard. And basically it had to do with if there was a VA out there that had less than a year's worth of data, the way the auditors were interpreting the language was that they were automatically non-compliant because they couldn't meet their previous year's average, which they didn't have. So the drafting team clarified some language to address that. And then there were some minor non-substantive language revisions. It was presented to the board last week. It was unanimously approved. So we'll be forwarding it to NERC with a request to file with FERC. Since we made some minor changes, I guess even if you change punctuation, we have to refile it. So we're gonna be filing that with NERC, or forwarding it to FERC for their acceptance and then filing with FERC. And then finally, we have the PRC 001-WECC-CRT governor group criterion. And it's a criterion that basically has one requirement that says your governor group should be set between 3 and 5%. As there have been with many NERC standards, I don't believe it was ever the intent to exclude inverter-based resources. But at the time it was drafted, it wasn't on anybody's mind, just like a lot of the NERC standards right now. When they were drafted, IBRs weren't on anybody's mind. And as we all know now, IBRs are a big deal. So we made some clarifications to the facilities background and overview section to address the IBRs and say, look, if your IBR has the ability to respond, it has to respond. That was also unanimously approved by the board. Since it's a criterion, it does not have to be accepted by NERC or approved by FERC. So it will become effective October 1st of 2024. Excellent. I think my first bullet on this NERC activities last quarter was the same. NERC has roughly 24 active or new projects. They've recently gone in and prioritized those 24 projects as high, medium, or low. There are currently 11 high priority projects out there. And basically, NERC has said any project with a FERC mandated completion date or NERC Board of Trustees directed completion date are going to be prioritized as high. So there's 11 of those right now. The others, I think there's only 3 or 4 medium, and the rest are low. Low and medium priority projects probably will not be addressed until 2025 or 2026. As a high priority project moves out, which means is completed, is approved by the ballot pool, accepted by the NERC board and accepted by FERC, it'll roll off the project list. So one of the median projects can roll in. But with so many of the due dates being in November and December of this year, it doesn't look like a lot of medium priority projects are going to roll in this year. Like I said, rather than wanting to go through all 24 projects, I've got a link here, but you can go to the NERC standards under development page and see how it's prioritized and see what all the projects are. I think we have one more slide. Just a couple of NERC recent ballots. The energy assurance with energy constrained resources had the dubious honor of receiving the lowest initial ballot approval percentage of all time. They got just over 6% approval. One of the drafting team members is an employee here at WECC, and I spoke with him, and he told me flat out the drafting team did not think it would pass, but we wanted to post it to get industry feedback. WECC did vote negative and provide comments. Several of our comments included that some of the requirements were too stringent for smaller VAs, especially those that were part of the reserve sharing group. And we suggested or asked if the RSG ought to be pulled into the applicability section, similar to, I think it's Val 2, where it says it's applicable to a BA or an RS, or the BA's in an RS. If the RSG has a bunch of BAs, it's applicable to the RSG and not each individual BA. So I did hear feedback back from our drafting team member that said, I saw a lot of the comments. I thought they were really good, and I think they're really going to help us moving forward to improve this standard. So this may be one, next time it gets posted, it may have a waiver. You may not get a full 45 days to comment, but hopefully it'll be more in line with what we're looking for. And finally, project 2023-03, the internal network security monitoring. The ballot closed on March 18th. So as I was preparing these slides for this call today, I did not know what the results were going to be. But I found out on the 19th that it did fail. It only received a 48.52% approval rating. As you know, it needs 2/3 pass. But the good news, and we heard about this yesterday at the NERC Standards Committee, the drafting team chair was on, and he said the good news is the first posting of this, they had a proposed standard SIP 007-X, and they were trying to modify a current standard, and it only got 15.42% approval. So this new one, this latest posting, they came up with a new standard to address this security monitoring, SIP 015. And it, like I said, it got a 48.5% approval. So it went up a little over 33%. Again, they said, we got a lot of really good comments. They said out of the, I think they had 10 questions, 11 questions maybe, on the comment form. And they said only 2 of them received more no than yes comments. And the first question got 100% yes. So the drafting team feels like they've made some significant improvements in some areas. And based on this latest round of comments, they feel like they know where they need to go with the standard for the next ballot. And I believe this is the one where the drafting team chair said, I'm fairly confident we can address some concerns to where we could get a approval on the next ballot posting. And I think I've got one more slide. Yeah, the NERC SC meeting was just held yesterday, so I couldn't really put anything on the slide about it because I didn't know what was going to happen. There were 4 action items. They were all approved unanimously. One was a very minor change in a process for handling remanded interpretation for request. They changed one word from should to will. And then there were 3 other action items. They were all for posting standards for comment and ballot. 2 had to do with the IBR standards, PRC 24, PRC 29, and PRC 30. And the final one was, and those had a request for a shortened comment and ballot period, but that waiver was already approved back in December. So all NERC was doing was using the waiver they already had. And they're asking for that waiver because of the FERC mandated deadlines on the projects. The final one was for TPL 008, which is the extreme weather planning standard. NERC also has a waiver for that due to the FERC deadline, but they didn't ask to use the waiver this time. So it'll be for a full 45-day comment and ballot period. All 3 of those postings you should see coming up within the next few weeks. I think the 2 on IBRs will probably come out on March 29th, or 25th, I'm sorry, March 25th. There's 2 projects that are currently out there. Well, there's more than 2 now, but when I made these slides, there were 2. The IBR event reporting, that comment period closes March 27th, and the verification of models and data for generators and inverter-based resources related definitions closes April 8th. So I would just encourage everybody to get out there and, please review it. Please provide your comments to the drafting team, because if there's something you don't like, you don't tell them, they won't know. And it's really unfortunate when the drafting team finds out on a final ballot that there's a bunch of stuff that people don't like. that they could have been addressing in earlier versions. So please get your comments turned in, and if you have any questions, you can call me. If I don't know, I can certainly try to point you to the right SME. I think that's it on mine. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so that's it. Any questions?
We have received one question for you so far. It says, with the high number of standard changes coming over the next 3 years, does WECC anticipate hiring more staff to handle auditing the new workload and helping register the new entities?
Did you say auditing the new workload?
It did speak to auditing, but also I think maybe just if you have any insight into how
Right.
WECC is planning to address
Well,
these changes.
I can speak for the standards department, and we do not foresee the need for new people. I cannot speak, and maybe someone else on this call can, for the auditors or the SMEs, the experts that we have, because I lean on them a lot. I'm not, first to admit I'm not all knowing. I rely on the SMEs for a lot of our positions and comments. So I don't know what the plans are there. They don't come to me with those kind of questions. So I don't know if there's anybody on this call that can answer it, if we want to try to dig into that and find an answer for whoever asked it, but
Yeah, we
I
can
don't
take
know.
that back to the CMEP group, but I appreciate you giving the plans for your department. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
And I am not seeing any other questions for you, Steve. So thank you very much for your update today.
Okay, thank you.
Coming up next is Monica. So I'll go ahead and turn the time over to her.
Hi, thanks, Maylee. Good afternoon, everyone. Like Maylee said, my name is Monica Vela. I am a cybersecurity auditor here at WECC, and today we'll be talking about key changes made to the ER team, where to find it, who was involved, when it takes effect, and we'll be going through the tabs as well. And yeah, so here's a quick agenda. We can go on to the next tab. Thank you. So first things first, there's a new ERT, just in case you haven't heard. Yes, there is. We are now on version 8.1, and that was released last month on February 8th. And here on the screen, you can see the guide on where to find that if you haven't grabbed it and downloaded already for your entity. Okay, the next slide. Okay. And the new ERT version, it will be implemented for audits beginning this July. The ERO Enterprise, or EROE, which is made up of NERC and regional entities, we meet on a monthly basis to discuss feedback amongst the regions and address comments and feedback from the industry as well via the Security Working Group. Major changes are implemented annually so far. Next slide. Okay, so we'll begin with the level 1 tab. On this one, we have the due date has been hidden. It is still there if your entity needs to use it. However, the RFI due dates will be determined by a line. And the column for SEL reference ID was added, as you can see here on the screen. And this column will automate the SEL reference ID. Next slide. And still on the level 1 tab, references to the now inactive SIP 4-6 and SIP 11-2 were updated to reflect the new versions. Again, in case you didn't know, those went into effect at the beginning of this year. And a few requests were created for clarification purposes. So with more detailed scopes and not all requirements always being part of the scope, we broke these out under SIP 8 and SIP 9. Each requirement has a request to provide the documented plan. For example, in SIP 8, R2 was in scope. We're asking for you to provide that cybersecurity incident response plan, where, as before, if it was only being requested under R1, and if R1 was not in scope, then that was a small gap that was missing there. Same for SIP 9, and the same goes for SIP 5. The request for configuration files was added under the R2 request, where it originally was being requested only under R1. When R1 was out of scope, the auditors found that additional RFIs were required since we were not getting those configuration files up front. Okay, And the description for the BCSI worksheet was also updated from providing a list of designated storage locations for provisioned access to providing a list of BCSI groupings for provisioned access. And we'll go into that one a little bit later in the slides. Okay, moving on to the level 2 tab. So same as level 1, the due date was hidden, but again, it's there for your use if you need it. And the SEL reference ID column as well, that's automated in this new version. Next slide. Okay, and still on level 2 here. So for SIP 12, this request here, SIP 12 R1 L201, the request to provide implementation of security protections was included for real-time assessment and real-time monitoring data being transmitted between control centers. So you can see on the screen here, I don't know how big or small it is for you, but you can see the highlight there. 1, 2, and 4 was there before, so it was just the number 3 added there. And again, references to the older versions of SIP 4 and SIP 11 were removed, as was the removal of designated storage locations. In the image shown, again, I'm not sure if you can see it, but that was removed. It just now reads access to BCSI and how BCSI is protected. Okay, next slide. Great. And for these next tabs, the TCA and RM, there was a new column added towards the end there. You can see them in red. So this asks if any changes were made during the audit period, and any changes can include changes in vulnerability management, malicious code detection, or other management process, including the activation or deactivation of TCAs and RMs during the audit period. All right, next slide. Okay, and this is where we see a little bit of more of a change here. So I'm going to have 2 slides on this one. So for this first one, the headers in this tab were updated. Notice again, designated storage location, that was removed, and it was replaced here with BCSI groupings and description. So here, if you can to provide the name or identifier of the logical groupings of BCSI. Next, the tab we have description of protection method, that's a new one. And impact rating remains the same. And storage type was replaced with BCSI type. And then again here, we added the question to ask if there were any changes made during the audit period. And we do have some drop downs for these. If we can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So here are the drop downs. You can see for the BCSI type, the electronic off-premise was added here. Again, this was formerly known as storage type. Impact rating has the same drop down. And for changes made during the audit period, we have true for that option. Otherwise, just leave it blank if it's not applicable. Okay, next slide, please. And for the personnel tab, seeing again that theme where storage locations was removed, these examples just show the before and after. And again, throughout the ERT, it will just be access to BCSI, access to best cyber system information, no longer the storage locations. Next slide. All right, and finally, but definitely not least, on the procurement tab, these columns were removed. So for the identification and assessment start date and identification and assessment end date, the audits will focus on procurement start and end dates. And this is a great example where the security working group made the suggestion to remove these. So it was brought to the EROE. The request was reviewed, we discussed it, and ultimately accepted the request, and that was removed. There were a few other changes made throughout the ERT, but they were very minor typos and things like that. And there you have it. I believe that's it. Yep.
Thank you so much for that update on the tool. We just got a question for you. It says, can you give examples of changes made in the audit period for BCSI tab that would be true? Let me know if I
Yes,
need to repeat
so
that.
oh, thank you. Yes, so any type of examples would be if you brought anything new onto your system. So if you have a new BCSI in the cloud, so that would be a new source to add to it. Or if you decommission something, that would also be true.
That makes sense. Okay. I am not seeing any other questions at this time. Thank you so much for that presentation. And we will hand it off now to Tom.
Thanks, Maylee. Monica, that was awesome. Thank you. Mike, thanks for joining me today. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I hope to see many of you at the workshop next week. That will be fun. Wow, it's been almost 2 years since SIP 12 became effective. We've had quite a bit of experience in the field. We've learned a lot, and we continue to get questions. And so we thought it could be timely to do a presentation on SIP 12. And the topic we've picked is specifically link identification. Many of the questions we get have something to do with link identification. So that's the focus today. And next slide, please. We'll review the agenda. We're going to start with functional applicability of SIP 12. What's kind of interesting about SIP 12, it's written like an O&P standard, meaning it's based on functional applicability rather than a typical SIP standard based on asset applicability. We'll talk about what is real-time assessment and real-time monitoring data, and we'll just be shorthanding that to RTA, RTM during the presentation. We'll cover these key concepts: control centers, associated data centers, communication scenarios, alignment with O&P standards, IRO 10 and TOP 3. What is the concept of joint responsibility in SIP 12? What is the context for a SIP exceptional circumstance in SIP 12, and specifically related to link failure or control failure? And I'm pretty geeked about being able to offer you a suggested process, a flow chart, a decision tree that you can use to determine applicable SIP 12 links. So let's go to the next slide to get started, and I'm going to pass to Mike to talk about functional applicability.
Well, thank you, Tom. Like everybody, Tom said, my name is Mike Krum. I am a WECC auditor here, and SIP 12 is one of my favorites. Not the only one that I work on, but it is one of my favorites. So today we're going to be talking about the functional applicability to the standard. So mainly, next slide, please. So who does SIP 12 really apply to? Well, according to the standard, we are looking at the responsibilities entities such as the BAs, the GO, the GOPs, the RCs, the TO, and TOPs. One thing that you need to know about, though, is that SIP 12 can be to any of the hierarchy of entities, if you will. You can have your high, mediums, and lows based upon how you have a configuration set up for your control center. How is your data being passed? Maybe next slide, please. Tom?
All right, thank you, Mike. Yeah, functional applicability, that's the first key concept. Next key concept is real-time assessment and real-time monitoring data. Let's break that down a little bit. What is real-time? What are real-time assessments? What is real-time monitoring, and why is it not a defined term? I think we're going to find some fun history here. Let's go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to give you a peek at the requirement itself. You can see that the phrase real-time assessment and real-time monitoring data appears 1, 2, 3, 4 times in the top level requirement and each of the requirement parts. So we better figure out what that is. And let's go to the next slide, please. What is real time? We look at the NERC glossary of terms and we get this intriguing definition. Present time as opposed to future time. Okay, that seems obvious enough, I guess. But what is this reference to interconnection reliability operating limit standard? What is that? We'll come to that in a second, and I think you'll find that the history is pretty interesting. But let's talk a little bit more about this concept of real time. What is kind of magical about this big machine called the grid and this huge interconnection, this wide area that we all participate in? What's key is that we have some concept of clocks, and that these clocks are synchronized so that we are executing our tasks, whatever they might be, in real time, meaning at the same time, that everything is synchronized. Why do we do that? Safety primarily, security and resilience of the power system. So this is why real time is so important. Okay, we're going to talk now about this interconnection reliability operating limit standard. This goes way back to FERC Order 693, one of the foundation orders. That is one of our reasons for being here. On the right side there is a screenshot showing part of a long list of projects for developing NERC standards. And if you go to the bottom, in tiny type there, you can see captured in a red rectangle is this operate within interconnection reliability operating limits. This is an old project that has an interesting history, and let's go to the next slide, please. All the way back to 2008. It's intriguing. I'm still researching some of the history of this myself, and I'd welcome input from anyone. It was approved by NERC in 2008, but never approved by FERC. And it focuses on the EOP standards. You can see in one of the top cells there. What's interesting about this project and why it relates to CIP12 link identification is that this project proposed some new definitions that I think you'll find intriguing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here is page 1 from FERC Order 693, just for reference, and page 508 from that same big order showing all 80, a few of the 87 O&P standards that would become mandatory and enforceable. And you see we have some of the so-called version 0 standards in the list there. So just wanted to provide that reference from the FERC order. And now we can go to the next slide. In that project proposed in 2008, we have some intriguing definitions. You'll see if you skip to the bottom that real-time monitoring, which is not today a NERC-defined term, was actually proposed as a defined term with this project, as were real-time data, real-time assessment, and real-time. So real-time assessment and real-time are in fact NERC-defined terms today, but the two at the bottom are not. And I just thought you would find it very interesting, and maybe you've wondered yourself, why is real-time assessment defined and real-time monitoring not? Well, it never got out of the gate, real-time monitoring, but there's an interesting reference to what the idea was at the time. And let's go to the next slide, please. There on the left is today's definition of real-time assessment. I'll let you read it, and many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with it. It's much longer than the originally proposed definition. And on the right, just to show you that this thing really did exist, I've got a clip of a 4-page document of proposed new definitions that came with this iRoll project that never quite got off the ground, although separately the standards involved in that project, of course, did get off the ground. But at the bottom there, you can see real-time monitoring. Next slide, please. And I'm going to pass to Mike now to talk about CIP12's alignment with these two key O&P standards. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, as Tom mentioned during the presentation, CIP12 is more like a OP standard. And because of that, some of its grassroots are actually established from the alignment of the TOP 003 and the IRO 10. So let's go ahead and continue on. Marilyn, next slide, please. Okay, so what does this really mean? Okay, we're looking at the types of data that are applicable to a SIP12 process. Well, where do we start? Well, we got to start with the part of the definition that is looking at the real-time assessment and the real-time monitoring of that data. Okay, and this comes from, as Tom mentioned, from the IRO 10 and the top 003 standards. And just looking at the actual information right there, it just says, shall maintain a documented specification for the data necessary for it to perform its operational planning analysis, real-time monitoring, and real-time assessment. Okay, that's what we're looking at in SIP12. And so it's very much key parts to the standard. So if we look at that, we are looking at data that would be included part of your RC, your BAs, maybe an alternate control center, a backup control center, a secondary control center, a control center that may be sharing information with another region. We will talk about that as we continue on. Miley, next slide, please. Okay, so the technical rationale for this. Now, part of this is that the TOP3 and IRO10 standards were already out there, so they've been well known and used. So part of the SDT used that information to reinforce the SIP12 requirements. So we are kind of having an understanding of what past history has set up for the currency of what we need to look at. So if we're looking at that in yellow, it's basically saying data requiring protection in SIP12 consists of a subset data that is identified by, again, by the RC, the BA, TOP, and TOP-003, and the IRO10. The specifications and standards limited to real-time assessment data and real-time monitoring. Again, those key words, RTA and RTM, are all part of SIP12. And without that, it probably would not exist as we know it today. So part of that information, again, the SDT used that to build upon the future standard of SIP12 that we know today. Miley, next slide. Okay, so as a SIP auditor, what am I looking for as evidence as RTA and RTM analysis? Okay, I'm going to look at what type of hardware and protocols that you have available. What is actually being used? What is the data being shared that is being transmitted? So I'm looking at that type of information. Okay, that could be SCADA. It could be part of your ICCP, which is your EMS. It could be part of the DMP and RAS. So we have all this protocols that are potentially RTA or RTM data that's being transferred, but are we sure? So that's the things where you have to go into the analysis of that information. So part of that, your top 003 is a specification, and that allows entities to say, okay, do we truly have an RTA or an RTM link that is active? Do we need to look furthermore into that to find out, is there some other details that maybe are going on behind the scene of a link that we think, oh no, there's no RTA or no RTM, but there's a possibility there could be something that is missed. Okay, so we're looking at that again. So part of that in the SIP12 plan, or whatever plan that you have related to it, we are looking for the functional applicability. Is that if your entity does not have a control center that communicates with another control center, so we are considering that. And we're looking at a conclusion of the SIP12 plan might be that your entity does not communicate RTA, RTM to another control center. So we want to prove the negative as well. So we're looking at both sides of the equation, and part of that analysis could be very straightforward, or it could be very intensive in the way that we have to proceed to dive into the data being transferred. Bailey, next slide.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And let's talk about control centers now. And specifically, what I want everyone to catch here is this concept of associated data center. And we're also going to talk about communication scenarios. Next slide, please, Bailey. On the right, we see a snapshot of the definition of control center that came into being with Project 2008-06 for V5, version 5 of the SIP standards related to FERC order and related to FERC order 791. So what's important here is in that definition, we see the phrase including their associated data centers. SIP 12 standard itself does not mention associated data centers, but this concept is implicit in the definition of control center. Why is this important for SIP 12? Because sometimes a data center might be geographically separate from its associated control center. And from a SIP 12 point of view, what's important here is that we're treating that control center and geographically separate associated data center all as one holistic unit that needs the SIP 12 controls applied. That's the key concept there. And next slide, please. Wanted to give a reference for SIP 2 here in this concept of real time. This is a clip from the SIP 2 standard itself, and just thought you would find it interesting, the context of real time with regard to SIP 2, and how in SIP 2 we have kind of, instead of a real-time operational concept, we have a convention of a 15-minute threshold with regard to the availability of BES cyber assets and providing those BES reliability operating services, or BROS. So just wanted to give some context for SIP 2 there in real time. And next slide, please. All right, Mike, over to you for the communication scenarios that we see in the field.
Thank you, Tom. As Tom mentioned, yeah, we have seen many different type of communication scenarios while we've been at customer sites or customer entities. We have seen situations where we have control centers that are totally owned and operated by a single entity. These are usually the easiest ones to audit. Not always, but usually the easiest. We have the inter-entities, which are the control centers owned or operated by different entities. And these could be over a private network or over third-party networks such as Verizon or another ISP provider. The interregional, this has been very interesting, I should say, especially since my last audit. The different regions that share RTA or RETM data that go across different regional entities. There are certain things in SIP 12 that an entity owns parts of SIP 12. And for instance, if we look at a third-party network, we have a ISP, we have a VPN tunnel, we have a communication path that on one side you have entity A, and then on the other side you have entity B. So who is responsible for that? Well, entity A may not know what entity B is doing, but they have communications. They know what's going on. They talk to each other. Entity A, though, says we have the technical information at our hands. We can see what we are doing. We can actually alert and notify our operations that if a link goes down or if there's a link issue, we can be aware of that. And because of that, we have different scenarios that we look at. Bailey, next slide, please.
Thank Mike. That is awesome. And you actually, that was a great segue to the slide after this on joint responsibility. So thank you. This is, now we're starting to get more practical here. What should your thought process be as you're identifying SIP 12 links? Well, we've covered functional applicability. That's one. Now we identify the control centers and associated data centers, yours and others. Now we look for RTA, RTM. Now we look for the links that transmit the RTA, RTM. What has WECC seen for controls in SIP 12? We've seen three main areas. We've seen link encryption. This is protecting data in motion. We've seen physical controls, and we've seen where entities sometimes forget that this is an important and relevant control. if that SIP12 endpoint is in a PSP, you are providing PSP controls to that router or whatever the device is, and you should kind of claim that as credit for the collection of controls that you're providing for the SIP12 link. And of course, we've seen logical controls that can be monitoring, detecting, alerting, responding to potential compromises of the confidentiality and integrity of RTA, RTM. Interestingly enough, we have not seen any cases of the secure ICCP protocol that goes way back in the history of IT, but is seldom deployed. So just wanted to mention that as a footnote before we go to the next slide. And Mike has next, thank you, Meili. And Mike covered this really well. This is 1.3 in the standard, and this is specific to inter-entity communication. So we get a lot of questions about this. A contract or memorandum of understanding is not required for 1.3 for your communication with the other side. You are not responsible for implementing controls on the other side. The spirit of this is communication and collaboration and understanding, and so both sides know what each other is doing. So we're really looking for the analysis of whom am I connecting to, and have we discussed what our mutual responsibilities are? And next slide, please, and back to you, Mike, for SIP exceptional circumstance.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, SIP exceptional circumstances. This is one thing in SIP 12 that we have seen during our audits that, especially during the early audits of SIP 12, that a lot of entities did not include a certain verbiage in their SIP 12 plan. So part of this is what we're looking at, okay? A SIP exceptional circumstance is a situation that involves or threatens to involve one or more of the following or similar conditions that impact safety or BES reliability: a risk of injury or death, okay, not maybe in SIP 12, but okay, a natural disaster, hurricanes, tornadoes, okay, civil unrest, well, we won't go into that one, an imminent or existing hardware, software, or equipment failure, bingo. SIP 12, because the way it's written, we have many communication links that are discussed. And so a SIP exceptional circumstance could exist. So that is one thing we wanted to consider when we look at the plans. And next slide, please. Okay, so again, how could that apply in SIP 12? Well, you have a failure of control that your entity's plan requires to meet the security objective. Part of your security objective may be encryption. So if your encryption fails, do you possibly specify a SIP exceptional circumstances? Possibly, but it depends on your plan at that time. So as with that fails, it's a possibility to declare it. Therefore, what you want to do is that you need to monitor your links, which is a prerequisite for alerting about a link down status or encryption failed. So part of these, especially in encryption, because we've seen most entities specify the encryption is their security objective between control centers, that you need to be aware of that link. Whatever controls, monitoring, alerting, whatever you have, make sure that's in the plan of your SIP 12, and maybe it calls out another process or another plan, but just make sure that it is alerting to that information. So that's one thing that we've seen that we usually look for. And again, most of the time and most of the entities when we've done audits, the SIP exceptional circumstances is overlooked. So next slide, please. And Tom?
Thank you, Mike. And we're winding up here. We'd like to offer you, and we can go to the next slide here, a decision tree, a flow chart, a suggested process. We encourage you to try this out, and let's walk through it. So let's look in the middle at the two the two areas that have dotted boundaries around them. One is marked 1.2 and one is marked 1.3. Let me take you through this. Let's go to the upper left and the start. So as we've discussed, your first question, are we one of the functional registrations that apply to SIP 12? If you're not, you're done. If you are, drop down to 1.2. Does your entity have more than one control center as defined by NERC? If you do, then you have to evaluate the link between those two control centers for RTA, RTM. So here the decision tree is perhaps slightly confusing. Notice if you do have more than one control center, if your entity has more than one control center and you've completed that evaluation, you scoot right across to that next boundary and you skip the decision above it because it didn't apply to you. But if you don't have more than one control center, then you go to that top decision in the second boundary, and this is 1.3. Does your entity have at least a single control center as defined by NERC? If no, here's what I'd like to offer as a key point from an audit perspective. We're still, even in this no case, we're looking for evidence that you performed this analysis rather than a simple attestation. We'd like to see evidence that you've performed that analysis, and that's why we're offering this process. Okay, let's drop down to the second question in the second boundary. Does your entity connect to another entity's control center? If yes, evaluate all those links. And then after that evaluation, you're done. If not, then we go back to we're still looking for evidence that you've performed that analysis. So we encourage you to use this. Welcome your feedback on this. sip@wec.org is the best way to reach us. That way the whole team can see it. And Meili, that's a wrap for SIP 12. And are there any questions for us?
I am not seeing one at the moment, but I will give it just a beat.
Okay.
If Monica is actually still available, we did
cool.
receive a question for her that I wasn't able to ask at the moment. We'll give your group a chance to catch up and we'll ask Monica this one here. It says, if an entity is due to receive its audit notice package in June for a mid-October monitoring engagement, will they receive ERT version 8.1 or an earlier version?
Is this for, I'm sorry, the audit engagement is in October of this year?
Yeah, and so they're expecting their package in June.
Then yes, it will be the ERT version 8.1.
8.1.
Yes.
Great.
So all audits starting with July audits forward, everyone will get version 8.1.
Perfect. I think that's what people wanted to know. And we did get a SIP 12 question now. It says there was a brief explanation of the auditor's line of rationale for determining what is being considered RTA or RTM data qualified as in scope for an entity for SIP 12. Along these lines, what attributes would WECC qualify synchrophasers data being used as an informational or backup source of real-time information? Let me know if I need to repeat that. It was a long one.
Oh, that is an awesome question, and I was kind of waiting for it. Yeah, when is phaser data going to be part of our world? It is part of our world, but is it real-time assessment and real-time monitoring data? We've seen some cases where, wow, we really need to have a discussion. Are the operators using this for real-time visibility? Is it part of their decision-making process? Does it figure it all into state estimation? So I think it's a bit case by case here. Really, if you have this case yourself, we'd love to talk to you about it. Please contact us at sip@wec.org. In general, what I would say is that start with TOP3 IRO 10. If you get a TOP3 data specification, very likely a subset of the data in that specification is RTA, RTM. Whether phaser data is part of that, I think could be on a case-by-case basis. And we'd love to have a discussion with you if you still have particular concerns. I know we're at time here. Sorry, I could go on and on about phaser data. I love the subject. So thank you for asking that.
All right, thanks, Tom and Mike. We didn't get any other questions, so we'll go ahead and wrap this up for today. Thank you again to all of our presenters. I know it takes time out of your day to get this ready for us. We really appreciate it. We hope to see you all next month, April 18th at 2 p.m. at our next call. And thank you so much for being here with us today. We'll see you next time.